He's expressed admiration for the Chinese Communist Party.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar.
If you're being required to do things that make you weak and ashamed, then stop. Don't do them. Like one of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and Frankl was that systems go terribly out of control when people don't stop them when they're going mildly out of control. And you might say, I should just keep my goddamn head down and shut up. It's like, maybe you should. Like, that's not bad advice. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, and you don't need any more trouble than you need. But you got to ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what makes you think you're not selling your soul?
Nearly 2,400 years ago, the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle explored political philosophy. Aristotle concluded that it is evident that the form of government is best in which every man, whoever he is, can act best and live happily. In Philadelphia, some 2,000 years after Plato and Aristotle's time, a group of men was trying to write a constitution. George Washington, James Madison, and the other framers of the Constitution were dedicated to constructing a just government. Americans had overthrown what they considered a tyrannous British government. The framers wanted to create a national government free of tyranny, governed by the rule of law.
Our parliament is not running for the next year. It's still Zoom in. It's still COVID lockdown parliament. For the next year, it's already been fatally compromised, perhaps, by the lockdowns for the last couple of years. And this is Parliament we're talking about. You're Prime Minister. And he's expressed admiration for the Chinese Communist Party because they can be very efficient in their pursuit of environmental goals. It's like, oh yeah, efficiency, eh? The efficiency of the tyranny in the service of your terror. And I've watched him repeatedly, and I've listened to him a lot, and I've tried to do that clinically and with some degree of dispassion. And that's hard, too, because his father, Pierre, devastated the West.
Plato, one of the earliest thinkers and writers about democracy, predicted that letting people govern themselves would eventually lead the masses to support the rule of tyrants. When I tell my college-level philosophy students that in about 380 BC he asked, does not tyranny spring from democracy? They're sometimes surprised, thinking it's a shocking connection. But looking at the modern political world, it seems much less far-fetched to me now. In democratic nations like Turkey, UK, Hungary, Brazil, and the US, anti-elite demagogues are riding a wave of populism fueled by nationalist pride. It is a sign that liberal constraints on democracy are weakening. To philosophers, the term liberalism means something different than it does in partisan US politics. Liberalism as a philosophy prioritizes the protection of individual rights, including freedom of thought, religion, and lifestyle, against mass opinion and abuses of government power.
How can discourse in a great democracy have become so polarized that Jordan Peterson and the Prime Minister look at exactly the same set of events and come to opposite conclusions about them?
Well, he's lying, and I'm not. So that's a big part of the issue. I don't believe that he ever says a word that's true. From what I've been able to observe, it's all stage acting. He's crafted a persona. He has a particular instrumental goal in mind, and everything is subordinated to serve that.
Why? What's the motivation?
The same motivation that's generally typical of people who are narcissistic, which is to be accredited with moral virtue in the absence of the work necessary to actually attain it.
Plato and Aristotle both developed important ideas about government and politics. Two of the many political subjects that these men wrote about were tyranny and the rule of law. Tyranny occurs when absolute power is granted to a ruler. In a tyrannical government, the ruler becomes corrupt and uses his power to further his own interests instead of working for the common good. The rule of law is the principle that no one is exempt from the law, even those who are in a position of power. The rule of law can serve as a safeguard against tyranny because just laws ensure that rulers do not become corrupt. Both Plato and Aristotle lived in the democratic Greek city-state of Athens. In Athenian democracy, all male citizens directly participated in making laws and deciding jury trials. Yearly elections decided who would fill important government positions. Citizens drew lots to see who would staff the remaining posts. Athens had reached its height in political power before Plato was born. Its decline began with a long war with Sparta, a rival city-state. The war ended in 404 BC with Athens' defeat. Athens regained its democracy, but shortly after Plato's death, the city-state fell under the control of Macedon, a kingdom north of Greece. The city remained, however, a cultural center.
Exploited the West and expressed contempt for the West far too much for far too long. And that's accelerating at the moment, for example, with Trudeau's recent attack on the Canadian farmers. He's an enemy of the oil and gas industry. It's an utter and absolute bloody catastrophe. And look what's happened in Europe, at least in partial consequence. And he's no friend to the farmers. So I've tried to steelman him, I try to put myself in the position of the people that I'm criticizing. I think he's a narcissist. If you're not suited for the position, if you're not the man for the position, you can be absolutely 100% sure that the power will corrupt you. How could it not? I mean, at the least, if you don't have the chops for the job, you have to devalue the job to the point where you can feel comfortable inhabiting it.
Whenever he sensed that arrogance was making them more confident than the situation merited, he would say something to strike fear into their hearts. And when, on the other hand, he saw them fearful without good reason, he restored their confidence again. So it came about that what was in name a democracy was in practice government by the foremost man.
One potential response to that would be the claims are not in accordance with the facts. But, facts are tricky things, and it depends on where you look for them. So that's a tough one to get right because, for example, Lomberg's fundamental critics argue about his facts, not just his interpretation of them. So that can't be an unerring guide. And so I thought, well, the facts exactly doesn't work because when it's about everything, there's too many facts. So then how do you determine if someone's a trustworthy guide in the face of the apocalyptic unknown? Because that's really the question. And the answer is, they're not terrified tyrants. I think that's the answer.
The people have always some champion whom they set over them and nurse into greatness. This and no other is the root from which a tyrant springs. When he first appears above ground, he is a protector. Having a mob entirely at his disposal, he is not restrained from shedding the blood of kinsmen. He brings them into court and murders them, at the same time hinting at the abolition of debts and partition of lands. After a while, he is driven out, but comes back in spite of his enemies, a tyrant full grown.
So you think, well, why should you speak up? That's easy, because the consequences of not speaking up, although delayed, are far worse. That's the reason. That's the reason. If it can't be courage, it could at least be prudence. So